Good evening. Welcome to our midweek Bible study. It's Wednesday night. You are in the auditorium class for the adults. We are continuing a series of lessons we started a number of weeks ago. We've been looking at this idea of contradictions in the Bible. And as you've probably observed, if you have some skeptical, unbelieving friends, family members, co-workers, or you fool around on social media, you've probably realized that there's a lot of folks that have this idea of contradictions in the Bible. And so we've dealt with that subject, like I mentioned, for a number of weeks. And we find ourselves tonight finishing what we started last week. It's not necessarily a contradiction per se, as if one statement or scene in the Bible were contradictory to another, but it's a topic that is troubling to many a skeptic or critic of the Bible. And that's this idea of what we would call mystical creatures. Maybe you've seen a meme or something that floats around the internet like this, criticizing the idea that in the Bible you'll find mention in the King James Version exclusively this idea of unicorns or other mystical creatures. And so we started that discussion last week. We'll quickly review, pick up there, and then we'll talk a little bit more about this subject as it pertains to a couple of creatures that are described in the book of Job. So we talked about how there's this idea of all these mythical, made-up creatures, fairy tale type creatures mentioned in the Bible. And so maybe people will point this out in a meme or something of that nature, you know, which one of these is not in the Bible? And the joke is all of them are. Dragons are mentioned and unicorns. And of course, we think about the beginning of Genesis and Satan being depicted or manifested as a talking serpent or some of these other, I don't know, I guess mystical creatures. Now, of course, they don't look like that, but they are mentioned. And so we need to do some explanation. So we started looking at these mythical creatures by the first one that we addressed. And again, I want to mention, these are exclusively found in the King James. If you have, for instance, a New King James or one of the other more modern translations, you won't necessarily run into these words that are used to describe specific and literal animals, like the satyr, if I'm pronouncing that right, which is, in mythology, literally a half goat, half man. On the top looks like a man, on the bottom looks like a goat. I mean, imagine that. That's just mythical, fairy tale, non-existent animals. And so if they're mentioned, we've got a problem. And you will see them mentioned by name on a number of occasions. Now, the underlying original word just meant literally a goat, a he-goat or a hairy goat. Or it was associated with demonic offerings to a goat idol, which would be, again, akin to demons or the devil. You might think of imagery that shows the devil as having hooves or horns or appearance like a goat. And some of that comes from this notion. But it certainly is not, a mythical fairy tale creature. It just means a goat in the Hebrew. But when it was rendered in the English in the King James, it came out with this particular word. Or the one we looked at, cockatrice, which literally is a mythical creature by name. This name is associated with a creature that's half a rooster, half a snake, and has the folklore of being able to stare at you and with a glance turn you to stone. And that's in the Bible? Yeah, in the King James Version there's that word. In fact, it appears a number of times. But what does the word mean in the underlying original text? In the Hebrew, what would it mean? It'd mean a poisonous viper or an adder, which is a venomous or poisonous snake. And that's what it meant in the Hebrew. However, in translating the King James, they use this particular word. Okay, you might say, well, why? So I don't have an answer to that. There are other occasions, and this is probably the most notable, and it gets the most criticism or, attention. And that's this notion or mention of unicorns. Unicorns. Does anybody happen to have the King James Version and would volunteer to read for us? Would somebody with the King James Version be willing to read Isaiah 34:7 And then we'll look at Numbers 23:22. Who can read that for us?
And the unicorn shall come down with them, and the bullocks with the bulls, and their land shall be soaked with blood, and their dust made fat with fatness.
Okay, so this is describing a literal animal. And it's called, in the King James Version, a unicorn. Now, that's problematic, right? I mean, is there anybody that says, well, I think that's a great rendering, unicorn? I mean, again, it's problematic to the critic and the skeptic, obviously, and they point that out vigorously. Let's look at one more. Numbers 23:22. Somebody read that for us?
God brings them out of Egypt. He has strength like a wild ox.
Or in the King James, if you have it, he has strength, God does, like a unicorn. And there's a lot of critics, a lot of skepticism, sarcasm, and, poking fun and deriding the notion that, God has strength like a unicorn. That makes sense. Yeah, you're serving a God that's like a unicorn. Even your Bible says that. I mean, that's what the skeptic or the critic will say. Now, again, we won't find that in, I don't think, any modern translation. But the King James renders it unicorn. Now, I don't know why. There's no indication in the original word. Re'im is the Hebrew word, if I'm pronouncing it correct. It doesn't have any notion of any mythical creature. It has kind of a broad definition of an animal, which is usually rendered an ox, or, more literally, a horned animal. How many of them are there? I don't know either, but a bunch. However, where did this unicorn word come from? It comes from the Greek. There's a Greek translation of the Old Testament. Now, the Old Testament's originally written in Hebrew with small sections of Aramaic and a couple of books. But there's a Greek translation. And they used this word, monokeros. Anybody want to guess what monokeros means? One horn. There you go. So that's the word. So what's another way to say one horn? Unicorn. What's a unicycle? One wheel, okay? So the idea came that there was a one-horned animal, or mono-horned animal. The original Hebrew just had the idea of a horned animal, or a very generic term for animal. All right, so what's the explanation? One explanation that people offer is there's actually an animal. It's a rhinoceros, and its genus name is Rhinoceros unicornus. And it's a real animal, and I'm not good at counting, but let's count them horns together. Those black things are birds, incidentally. 1. All right. Here's another one of the same variety, just a different color. A little bit different variety, but the same genus. How many horns does it have? 1. So some will suggest that this is a definition, or explanation rather, for this idea. But it really just meant a horned animal. And it's only the King James that used the word unicorn, which was not at the time associated in the 1500s. It actually goes back to the Wycliffe Bible from the 1500s, and then it came into the King James Bible. But they didn't have this notion of a winged horse with one big horn, riding on a rainbow, But that's a plausible explanation. Or any horned animal, or some other horned animal that may have become extinct. But it certainly wasn't the mythical creature of a unicorn. All right, any questions about that? Oh, you're saving all your questions for the next mythical creature. Dragons. Dragons. Dragons is actually a very common word in the King James Bible. Do I have another volunteer that can read from the King James for us and read Psalm 74 and verse 13? Psalm 74, verse 13. Who will read that for us? All right, go ahead, Miller.
Thou didst divide the sea by thy strength. Thou breakest the heads of the dragons of the water.
Now, this is a psalm that's attributing attributes of God that are unique and praiseworthy. In fact, in the next verse of that psalm, he talks about him able to tame or kill or control the Leviathan, which I want you to think about and put a pin in because we're going to talk about that. But here is the term dragon, and it's saying God is able to subdue dragons. You mean the mythical creature of fairy tales? Hold on, we'll talk more about that and see if we can get a little working definition. There's other occasions, like we might mention Isaiah 13. What's interesting is we've talked about Isaiah 13 a couple of different times. It was a woe against Babylonia, the Babylonian Empire. And in these woes, he talks about how their destruction will be devastating. Will somebody read for us in Isaiah 13 in verse 22 there, if they have the King James?
And the wild beasts of the islands shall cry in their desolate houses, and dragons in their pleasant palaces. And here, in her time is near to come, and her day shall not be so long.
So here we have a mention of dragons, as if they are, but describing them as being literal animals. So, again, the skeptic, the critic would very quickly say, see there? How are you following this book and saying it's from God if it mentions things that don't exist, like a dragon? All right, so let's see if we can look at an explanation. Here's what I'd like to do. While I mentioned the fact that dragons are mentioned quite often, I want to look at a few descriptions of this dragon and see if we can get our mind around what that might have been. All right. Number one, in Isaiah chapter 27 and then again in Isaiah 51, there's the reminder that this particular animal, a dragon, whatever it is, it's described as being very powerful. In fact, this description is often associated with either an inability of man to subdue it or the ability of God to be able to subdue it. Does that make sense? And so it's very powerful. It's also described, interestingly enough, as making a very loud noise. In the minor prophet Micah in chapter 1 and verse 8, it talks about the wail and the howl of the dragon. So it makes a loud noise, and they're very powerful, they're strong. They can live either in the wilderness, according to Isaiah 43, or they can live in the water, according to Isaiah 27. And other places, incidentally. Miller just read for us a moment ago in Psalm 74 that they were water creatures, water dragons, dragons of the sea. Now again, can I get somebody that has the King James Version to read for us Genesis 1:21? And then I want someone who doesn't have the King James Version to read Genesis 1:21. Both of these words are the words that are elsewhere rendered dragon. Dragon. All right, so who can read Genesis 1:21 for us? Great.
And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good.
Same Hebrew word, here rendered great whale. Does anyone have a different version they would read for us? All right, Joanne?
So God created great sea creatures and
Oh.
every living thing.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Great sea creatures. Some translations may even say sea monsters. And the idea is that these were the great, large beasts of the sea. Now, why the King James put whales here instead of dragons, I don't know. Sea creatures is probably the best rendering. So the large sea creatures were made by God. All right? Now, I'll ask you this question. Let's review. They're very powerful. They make a loud sound. You can find them in the sea, and you can find them on the land. What's that sound like? Meaning, discussion, thought, question, comment. What's that sound like? A dragon there? Okay, alligator. Okay. Miller knows where I'm going. Sounds like a dinosaur to me. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Jurassic Park. Now, there's a number of them. I ain't seen all of them, and I'm not endorsing everything in them. I ain't even seen all of them. But I remember the original one, and one of the most scary things was it coming, and then, this boom, boom, and it would shake, the water glass that was sitting on the thing. And then when it got there, what did it do? It went roar. So they're very powerful. They're very large. They can't be subdued by men, but they can be subdued by God. He can control them. And they can be in the land or the sea. Sounds a whole lot like a dinosaur to me. So is it a mythical creature? I don't think so. I think it's describing dinosaurs. In fact, we'll talk about this a little bit. Well, we'll talk about this probably the rest of the class as we look at a couple of animals that are mentioned specifically by name and description in the book of Job. Why don't we go ahead and do that, and then I'm going to go back to this notion of dragons and talk a little more about it. Let's talk about the behemoth. the behemoth. If you have your Bible, turn over to the book of Job. Turn over to the book of Job. Now, I think it's very important that we understand the context of these statements about these two animals. Because often the critic or the skeptic will say, do you realize that you're following a book that's got all kind of mystical animals in it? And then sometimes they'll even say, have you ever read and studied about the behemoth and the leviathan that are mentioned specifically? That seems to suggest it's either a non-real, non-literal animal, or it's describing something that doesn't exist. Oh, well, what do we do about that? Let's talk about the behemoth. I think it's very, very important to note in the context what's going on. First, Job and his friends have been wrestling with why things are happening to Job the way they are. Doesn't seem fair. Job's a good guy, but bad things are happening to him. And so they wrestle with this throughout much of the book. Then at the end of the book, God shows up. And he answers all Job's questions. No, he does not answer all of Job's questions. In fact, he entertains or interrogates a series of questions to Job that he can't answer. And they're mostly about the animal kingdom, incidentally. They're about his providential care for the entire universe, our solar system, but specifically a lot to do with the animal kingdom. Something that he's familiar with, something that he's observed. At this point, when he begins to make these discussions and makes points about his ability and Job's inability, he's already mentioned 12 animals. Before he ever gets to behemoth, he's mentioned 12. All right, let's run through these, and I'm not going to mention all 12 of them necessarily, but what type of animals has he mentioned up to this point? Well, for example, he's mentioned a horse, he's mentioned an ostrich, he's mentioned an eagle, he's mentioned a lion, he's mentioned 12 animals that you and I recognize by name, with maybe a couple of exceptions for animals that were somewhat generic, or there may be some discrepancy as to what the best translation is. But most of them, we've all seen one before. 12 animals, horses, birds we know of, ostriches. All right, and then he's going to give us 2 more animals. Now, why in the world would he say, I want you to consider these 12, and then I'm going to make 2 up? Y'all with me? Why in the world would he say, okay, you've observed these 12 real literal animals, now I'm going to tell you about one that doesn't really exist? No, that doesn't make a lick of sense. Because even in the context, it's ruined because he's making points that require Job understand this animal. All right, he says he made the behemoth. Look at verse 15 of chapter 40. We'll run through this basic description here. He says, look now at the behemoth. And Job says, what's a behemoth? No. The idea was he said, look at it. You can observe it. It exists. It's real. It's literal. It's an animal, and it's present with you. Are y'all with me? All right. So then we get some descriptions of this animal. What in the world is he describing? As we drop down to verse 15, the first thing that we see about this behemoth is it eats grass like an ox. All right, what do we know about the behemoth? Well, it eats grass. All right, omnivore. Next, what do we know? If we look at verse 16 now, see now his strength is in his hips, or his hind legs, as opposed to his front legs. All right, that's just one fact. And again, we're not exhausting this. We're just looking at some key facts of description. And I was going to mention a disclaimer at some point. I guess I can mention it now. I think it goes without saying. I'm not a dinosaur expert. I'm not a paleontologist. Couldn't spell it, probably. You give me 10 tries, I might could spell it. But I'm no expert in this. But we're going to talk about some of these things that relate to dinosaurs. All right, there's my disclaimer. I may have to mention it again. But eats grass, strength in his hips. And then this is interesting. Look at verse 17 of this description of the behemoth. He moves his tail like a cedar. Cedar's a big tree, known for its strength. Okay. The next thing that we see is something interesting in verse 19. Look at verse 19 of chapter 40. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring him near his sword. Who made him? What is he saying? Now, when he says this first part of the statement, we could probably translate, this animal is the pinnacle or the first or the chief of the animals. Or the way me and you'd say it, this is the biggest one he made. But he also says the only one who can get near it to do anything with it is me, the one who made it. Now the point that he's making is Job's inferiority and his superiority. In other words, if I do that, don't you think I know what's going on in your life? If I can control all the animal kingdom, and I care enough to be involved, to feed them, to take care of them, and no matter how unapproachable they are to you, they're nothing to me. I mean, I made them. And if he's telling them that to make the application to all his concern about God being absent from caring and being involved and providentially helping him throughout his life, where are you, God? Look what's going on in my life. Don't you? Really? I'm not incapable. It's not that I don't care. It's that I require faith. And that wisdom is not something that I'm revealing to you. All right, but those are some of the descriptions. So let me ask you before you ask me, what in the world is this describing? What's the behemoth? All right, there's been a lot of suggestions. Some have suggested the elephant and the hippo. Those are the two most common suggestions. Does anyone see a problem with the description of Job 40 that we've read so far to fit either an elephant or a hippo? Their tail is one problematic thing. The other is there's no indication that they have any differentiating power or ability in their hindquarters or their back legs or strength in their hips. Have you ever seen an elephant? They're not great at running. If you ever seen a hippo, they're a little bit better at running, but if you look at them, they got 4 legs, almost look kind of like an elephant. They're not known for having great strength in their hips. That's what it says in the text. Crocodile is one that's suggested, although what's interesting is when we get to the Leviathan, we'll note some characteristics that sound more like a crocodile. All right, so those are some suggestions. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Supposedly run the world millions of years ago.
Okay.
But isn't that in conflict with what we're told through the Bible how old the earth is?
Yes. Part of your question I'm going to address toward the end. In other words, here's what I'm saying. I'm saying that God is describing to Job a dinosaur that he could look at. And that would mean, now Job's one of the oldest books in the Bible, probably written roughly, I don't know, we can't say for certain when it was written, but it's, let's just say easily 5,000 years old roughly. So 5,000 years ago, I think there were dinosaurs, and I ain't got a problem in the world with it. But we'll talk about that. I'll get to some of that in just a moment. In fact, I'll offer some evidence to support that, not just my opinion. But let me offer a suggestion to what the behemoth is, and we'll see if it fits. Now, the suggestion's been made, maybe an elephant, maybe hippopotamus. You can go look at an elephant's tail. You can go look at a hippopotamus' tail. You can go look at elephants and hippopotamuses and see if they line up. I don't think they do. But I will offer you a suggestion. It's the Bronchiosaurus. If you go to a museum, you'll find a Bronchiosaurus. I might not be pronouncing that right. I already gave you the disclaimer. I'm not an expert. But this is what a Bronchiosaurus looks like if you just dig up the skeletal remains or in the fossil record and the various things that we can find, put it together, it looks about like that. You'll have the basic scale by seeing the people in the foreground. Big old thing. Here's an artist's rendition. One of the things that scientists believe is that they were able to actually eat vegetation up in trees. You know how they did that? They got up on them hind legs and their back legs, and their strength was in their hips. It was able to pull them up. Now, what are we talking about when it says this is the pinnacle of God's creation? And nobody can draw near it to do anything to kill it, but he could. Now, this is kind of a scale. And what's interesting about dinosaurs is, remember how we mentioned that there were these dragons, and some were in the sea, and some were in the land, and they were strong and powerful. And you know, dinosaurs come in all sizes. There's dinosaurs that were, I don't know, maybe the size of a cow. You can see the scale down at the bottom. If you look at the bottom left, that's a person. And then the dinosaur to your right looks kind of like a rhinoceros, but it's, you know, one of the, I forget. I can't name them all. One of the things I'll mention is when I was a kid, I wasn't into dinosaurs. I never really had friends that were into dinosaurs. We were always into sports and, you know, playing outside. And I never really got into dinosaurs. I don't know their names, not really fascinated with them. But here's you kind of a scale. If you see the one that's got the little purple tiger-like stripes that's on your far left, his head's on your far left, that's your Bronchiosaurus. Compare that to the size of man. Pretty big difference. Pretty big difference. Now, like I said, one expert, and I'm not it, said the average dinosaur was probably about the size of a cow. Now, granted, there were ones that were really big, but then there were ones that were, the size of animals we got now, like elephants and rhinoceroses and the like. All right. Questions about that before we go and talk about the Leviathan, and then I'm going to talk about what Tony brought up. You trying to tell me that dinosaurs and men coexisted? That's not what science will tell us. And my answer is yes, absolutely. I ain't got a problem in the world with it, and I'll give you some evidence, and we'll talk about it here in just a minute. But I want to look at the description of Leviathan before we do. But I will pause. Questions, comments? All right, let's talk about the Leviathan. If you're still here in Job, you don't have to go very far, because we get into chapter 41, he's going to describe another animal. It too is made by God. That's really the point of this whole section, The whole section is just a series of reminders to Job. I did this, I did that, I made this, I controlled this. Where were you when I made the world? Where were you when, I do all this. This is me. I made all this stuff. And in verse 11 of chapter 41, he says, everything under heaven is mine. Why? Because I made it. It's mine. And then he gives this description starting in verse 1. The first thing that we see is a reminder to Job. Now, remember what he said? When we look back there, he says of the behemoth, he says to look and see, or to behold. And so here we get this same notion. He's not describing some animal that's mythical, that doesn't exist. Let's listen to a few of the descriptions. We start in verse 1. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook? Or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? In other words, can you catch it out of the water? Can you put a reed through its nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make supplications to you, speak softly to you? This is the idea of can you tame it? Can you make a covenant with you? You can get a dog, and it's pretty much a wild animal. But they're so domesticated and pack-oriented, and they'll let you be the leader and be submissive, and they'll be in your little house and it'll be fine. Now, there are rare exceptions, but the point is you can tame it. You can domesticate it. You can't do that with this animal. So he's describing how you can't catch it, or you can't tame it, or put a leash on him, verse 5. We also see in the description that you can't kill it. Look at verse 7, still in chapter 41. Can you fill his skin with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hand on him. Remember the battle? Note that next phrase. Never do it again. I tried that once. I will never try that again. So, kind of like I've not done this, but maybe you rode a bull. I'm gonna ride a bull. I'm gonna make it 8 seconds. Try that once. I'll never try that again. That's what he's saying. Go to battle with it, and you'll never try it again. Keep reading, verse 9. Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. Shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? The sight of him. No one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? Is this about animals or God? And what he's doing is describing the most ferocious animal that he can. I mean, he describes a number of animals, but here in the points of the behemoth and the Leviathan, he's describing these animals, and he's saying, these animals are unapproachable to you, but they're nothing to me. We keep reading and we look at this notion of trying to kill it. Drop down to verse 26, still in chapter 41. Though the sword reaches him, it cannot avail, nor does spear, dart, or javelin. He regards iron as straw, and bronze as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. Sling stones become like stubble to him. Darts are regarded as straw. He laughs at the threat of javelins. His undersides are like sharp pot shears. He spreads pointed marks in the mire. Now, we'll come back to that. If you've ever seen an animal like this one, when it walks, it doesn't just leave footprints, but it actually leaves a line from where it's dragging its belly and other part that I won't get into without giving it away. But you can't catch it, can't kill it. And then it talks about its outer coat, this Leviathan. Look at verse 13. Who can remove his outer coat? Who can approach him with a double bridle? In other words, you can't tame it, you can't catch it, you can't kill it, you can't even stand the sight of it, you can't even approach it. And then we drop down to verse 15. I'll go back and read verse 14 in a minute. His rows of scales are his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal. One is so near another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together and cannot be parted. And so it's describing this interlocking system of scales that make up its outer armor, its outer coat, its skin. And then it describes in verse 14 its terrible teeth. Look at verse 14. Who can open the door of his face with his terrible teeth all around? So he's describing something that lives in the water. You can't tame it, you can't catch it, you can't kill it. It has this outer coat that's impenetrable with these scales that would interlock and these terrible teeth. And even the sight of it would be something that you wouldn't even approach. What's this describing? What do you think? Ever seen anything like that in the water? Maybe it's one of these sea creatures. Maybe it's a dragon. Here are the suggestions. A whale. I don't see that. Alligator or crocodile. Anybody ever seen an alligator or crocodile? Yes. They're pretty ominous. How big do they get? Roughly. 18, 20 feet? I don't know what the world record is. Something like that. Do you know that there's one that's, again, there are as many as 8, as I understand it, prehistoric or dinosaur-esque crocodiles or alligators. They have a variety of names. I'm not going to try and pronounce them. But here's an artist's rendition of one. They were believed on average to be 3 to 5 times the size of the biggest alligator on the earth. Biggest alligator we got now. 3 to 5 times the size. You find things like this in Jurassic Park or those type of movies or videos, and the idea is that they were big enough to take on these big animals. They existed. No denial. What's the Leviathan? I think it's a dinosaur-esque, crocodile-esque type dinosaur. Do you know, I think the crocodile is a dinosaur. I think that of a number of animals. It's a kind of dinosaur. Just wasn't as large. All right. Questions about that?
Joe, what about verses 18 through 21?
Yeah. I'll ask you before you ask me. What exactly does that mean? Is it being literal? In verse 18, it talks about these flashes of light. Now, one of the things it's mentioning are the eyelids or the eyes. Anybody ever seen an alligator at night? Frogs are the same way, incidentally. Their eyes kind of light up. You can see it. It's spooky and eerie. If you go frog gigging at night, all you need is a flashlight and you can find their lights. So that seems to not be problematic for like an amphibian type creature. But it does say out of his mouth of the burning light, sparks of fire shoot out, smoke goes out his nostrils from the boiling pot of the burning rushes. His breath kindles coals and a flame goes out of his mouth. Now, I don't know if that's hyperbole or meant to be taken in some kind of way literal. I don't know the answer to that. I really don't. I know that this is a real creature. It's not mythical. It's not magical. It's not non-existent, because it wouldn't fit the context where God is literally asking Job to consider these 2 animals. And so Tony brought up the point that I knew someone would and that we would discuss. Dinosaurs and man? You mean they coexisted? They lived at the same time? And what he's describing, and what is described in this idea of dragon is akin to dinosaurs. Did dinosaurs really exist? Yeah. Have you ever heard someone trying to deny that they existed? No. There's no conspiracy to bring the bones out of the ground and make these animals up. They really existed. I don't have a problem with it at all. But the question on the table is, did they coexist with man? I believe that they did. All right, well, let me get a volunteer ever so quickly to read Exodus 20 and verse 11. Real easy, real familiar. Simple. Does anyone deny that there were creatures that we call dinosaurs that lived in the sea and lived on the land? Does anybody deny that? Well, what's this verse say? Well, God made all of them. They existed. God made them. And an interesting thing about Mark 10 and verse 6, it says, man was from the beginning of creation. What's that mean? Well, I mean, y'all read Genesis 1, right? He created the earth in 6 literal days, and that includes everything that ever walked on this planet, including me and you. On the 6th day, that's me, you, and, well, dinosaurs, right? We coexisted. That's what the Bible says. Now, let's talk a little bit about some evidence of that. And again, I'm no expert in this. You can do your own research. I did some research, and that basically means I Googled it and read a few things, and you can do that too. There are human artifacts, literal cave drawings from men. Now, I don't think they were from, 20 million years ago. We also have geological records, such as, for example, things that ought not be with dinosaur fossils, bones, and sites. Sites where they found whole, basically, dinosaur graveyards, and then they found footprints of humans. Well, with their fossilized. I'll show you an example. And then the various legends. I don't know of a culture in antiquity that didn't have legends surrounding dinosaurs or dragons or large sea creatures or birds that were described in fashions of coming down and taking on adult men and, with their size. These are all legends. Why? Well, because in the past, men coexisted with dinosaurs. Very large animals. Very large animals that, were of mythical proportions compared to anything we've seen. I mean, something, I don't know, exponentially larger than... Anybody ever seen an elephant? If you pay, they'll let you ride it. Save your money. Just look at it, take a picture. Don't ride it. Save your whatever it is now. It's $10, and I did it. I'm like, get me off this thing. But the point is, that is a magnificent animal. Imagine something, 4 or 5 times that size. And so we have all kind of legends. Now, I'm going to talk about their extinction in just a moment. Let me show you some of this evidence. This is just kind of a sampling of some of the various cave arts. This one, incidentally, that's got the circle on it in your far upper left, the circle at the top is of a man, and the circle at the bottom, boy, that looks just like a dinosaur. This is actually in Nevada. You can go see this particular cave drawing, and they date it back to like the 1200 AD. It's in Utah. There are others, incidentally, in some of the caves in the Grand Canyon, in Peru, and various other places. And again, I know this is subjective. You might say, well, that's just, somebody drawing, and I don't think it looks like a dinosaur at all. And I appreciate that it's subjective. But there are other lines of evidence. For instance, if you wanted to go to Cambodia, I remember years and years ago, we did not a summer series, we did a VBS on the flood, and we talked about some of these same things, and I mentioned this, and Melanie French, I remember she told me, well, I went to Cambodia and I saw this, and she actually got her picture with it. But if you go to Cambodia, there's a temple, and I don't know all the origin and the particulars of that temple, but if you look on the left, you can see an image, and then you zero in on it and zoom in, and again, this was more than 1,000 years ago, before our modern history. I don't remember all the particular dates, but that sure does look like a dinosaur, although you could argue, again, it's subjective. It might have been something else. Here are some artifacts, some items that have been found, sometimes of clay, sometimes of wood, and they're dated back to 1,500, 2,000 years ago, and they would have been like trinkets or toys or things that, even our kids. How far removed are we from dinosaurs? Nobody's ever seen one, but I know kids can still buy little plastic things. Well, this was long before that people made these artifacts. I don't know. Again, you could say it's subjective, but boy, some of those things sure do look like dinosaurs. This is the most noteworthy fossilized evidence that's problematic for the paleontologist. Now, the big 3-pronged print is the dinosaur. And in your left is the foot. I put this circle to help you. That's where the foot is. That's no argument. That's a human foot and a dinosaur track fossilized together. Did dinosaurs and man coexist? Well, if dinosaurs did exist in reality, and I don't know that they did. Nobody in the room does, I don't think. Then God made them. And he made them In the days of creation. Yes.
That would almost indicate it was like the dinosaur was a pet.
Was what?
Was a pet.
Oh. I don't know that. Okay. Is that the second bell? All right. Well, Tony, if I went into the woods and my track was next to a bear track, would that mean that bear was my pet? No, he would eat me, right? A grizzly bear, and my print and a grizzly bear's print could be in the same general vicinity, in the same layer of the sediment that might be fossilized 1,000 years from now, but that doesn't mean it was my pet. All right, we'll have to pick up some of this because one of the biggest questions that I think is, if this is the case, then why are they now extinct? What caused them to be extinct? We might ask the question, were they on the ark? And I know we've had our second bell. Bear with me. I just want to say this, and we'll pick up here next week. I'd really hope to finish. But what about their extinction? Were they on the ark? Some of them were. How do I know? We still got turtles and alligators. And you ever looked at a rhinoceros and then looked at some of these rhinoceros-looking dinosaurs? I mean, we still have dinosaurs. So some were on the ark, some weren't, obviously, for their size. But, if I were going to take an alligator, did you know the babies, have you ever seen them? You can put them in the palm of your hand. You can just get a boy and a girl. But why did they all die? Why did they become extinct? If they were around when Job was around 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, how did they become extinct? Well, all you have to do is ask yourself questions about animals becoming extinct now, and we'll have to discuss that a little more later. In your lifetime, hundreds of animals have become extinct. And in the last 500 years, about 900 species have become extinct. And we'll look at that and talk more about that, and we'll have to pick up here next week. Appreciate your attention. Sorry I went over.